Chapter 7 Running Errands with Your Zombie Duck. The Magress Present. Reservoir Dreadbringer didn't like dealing with people. First of all, he had plans. Big plans. Rule the world kind of plans. Suffering through discourse with the common folk was bothersome. It also meant leaving the tower grounds and descending through the winding streets of Ardire. Going out in public was particularly annoying to the sorcerer. This was not because he was an indoor type who only wanted to read books, although, to be fair, he did like books and the tower was quite comfortable, but because he was feared. For most villains, being feared was one of the perks of being a figure of doom and menace, in addition to wearing black, which is naturally slimming. At first, Reservoir had enjoyed the simple pleasures of meeting a poor villager, afraid to make eye contact, or having some simpleton shrink back from his mere presence. He had especially liked it if the shrinking was followed by a bit of cowering. But over time, Reservoir discovered that being feared wasn't all it was cracked up to be. For example, he had a hard time getting waiters to come to his table, and most merchants would close their shops rather than risk having a sorcerer as a dissatisfied customer. He even had a much higher than normal percentage of lost mail, especially when it required hand delivery. In the end, being feared made dealing with the townspeople inefficient, and if Reservoir hated anything, it was having the things he hated doing take too long to accomplish. But at times, even he had no choice but to venture out. And so, Reservoir found himself traveling through the part of the city known as Guild Row. As was his custom, he rode in a black carriage pulled by a small, waddling, undead duck, referred to as a zombie duck. There was no sound quite like the slapping of the duck's webbed feet against the cobblestones to drive Ardire citizens to the side of the road, down alleyways, or behind barred doors and windows. Those who had dared venture near enough for a closer look might see the duck's crimson eyes, or the snake-like tongue that sparked when it touched the air. On one particularly unfortunate day, a clown and an elephant were drumming up business for the newly arrived circus when they mistakenly crossed the zombie duck's path. Several horrific seconds later, all that remained were two tusks, a red rubber nose, and an oversized novelty shoe. Not only did the circus lose much of its original appeal, many of the children had a hard time looking at clowns again, but the zombie duck had firmly cemented its reputation as a creature not to be trifled with, or at the very least, one who should be given the right of way at crossroads. The zombie duck was in fact a rare and peculiar breed of monster avian, born from a novice wizard's attempt to blend roasted duck, death by chocolate pudding, and zombie spice. The wizard later claimed it was all that had been left in the pantry on his night to cook. As the tower's regent, Reservoir adopted the duck as a kind of mascot and personal pet. Guild Row was a motley assembly of buildings that represented the many factions of professional life in Ardire. Reservoir's path took him past the so-called Guild of Magic, a brightly colored building with a half-sun and half-moon painted over the door. They were an unauthorized spellcaster union that picked up the rabble who either dropped out, were kicked out, or had never gained entry to the wizard's tower in the first place. The guild's very existence was an affront to Reservoir and all that the tower stood for. Such rogue magic was generally frowned upon by the Seven Kingdoms, but of late the king seemed overly tolerant of the guild's activities. As the sorcerer slowly passed the building, he decided he might make the most of his visit by sending a message. Reservoir muttered a few words under his breath and then flicked a fireball from his hand. The blue flame flew from the carriage window, soared across the street, and finally curved into one of the third-story windows. Reservoir gave it a count of 3, taking off the seconds as he worked some dirt under his fingernail. Boom! The entire street shook as doors and windows were blown from their frames. Soon robed figures, some of them aflame, dove from the building. Reservoir grinned as he settled back into his seat to the sound of the fire bell ringing. Magic was a dangerous business, and perhaps this would serve as a warning. The zombie duck continued on its way, producing more of a quack than a quack when it honked at the growing commotion on the street, until coming to a stop in front of an ornate building constructed from giant blocks of sandstone. It was the Lawyers' Guild, framed by two massive pillars and a door that was shaped like the giant, gaping mouth of a serpent. Over the door, the guild's motto was inscribed in stone, making the worst argument appear stronger. The establishment date was 399 BC, which predated even the Great Sundering. Reservoir stepped from his carriage, flipped his hood over his head, and pushed his way inside. The office was paneled in a dark, nearly black wood, with knots and holes that looked remarkably like human faces. Only these were twisted into portraits of agonized pain and suffering. The equally dark desk held a great hourglass, behind which a portly goblin was sitting in a high-backed leather chair. He was wearing a permanent scowl and had ears that shot out of the sides of his head and ended in 2 points, with the rest of his bulk stuffed into a tailor's suit. His thick, green-skinned fingers wrapped around the hourglass, and he turned the heavy timepiece over with a thud. "Now we are on the clock," the goblin rumbled, a small tussock of gray whiskers waving as he settled into his seat. The sergeant-at-law and supreme counsel to the king was the most important lawyer in Ardire. He was also on retainer from the male shadow, who preferred doing much of his dirty work through his attorney. Reservoir withdrew his hood. "You sent word for me?" "On behalf of the Lord of Shadows," the goblin replied, his double chin and fleshy jowls adding a deepness to his voice. "He wishes a report on the status of your arrangement." "Tell the male shadow that the unicorn has accepted my terms and even now is following the gimbal." "To the monks of the Tree of Attenuation, no doubt." "I would assume so." "As to that, the Lord of Shadows is concerned that the monks will refuse passage between the realms. He believes it would require damaging the tree itself." Reservoir produced a parchment from his robes and slid it across the table. The goblin grunted, recovering a pair of spectacles that hung from his neck on a golden chain. Once these were on, he leaned forward to read the hand-written draft. The goblin put the paper down and cast a wary look at the sorcerer. "That is what they want?" "Yes. I don't suppose the male shadow will take issue with the request?" "I don't presume to speak on behalf of the Lord of the Shadows, but I see no reason he would not accept." "The unicorn will not travel by boat. You know how their kind feel about water. Besides, it would be too dangerous to dock at Lannister, given the bounty the Morluin lords have placed on her head. No, she'll travel northwest and cross into Turil, then south past Nagelmosh and near Rhodos until she reaches the mountains of Wallen." "A long journey on treacherous paths," the goblin replied. "Long, yes, but not dangerous. Not for her." The goblin cleared his throat, wiping the lenses of his spectacles clean. "Let us hope so." "Either way, it allows us time to send word by carrier," Reservoir suggested. "Best to let Lenleric know a deal has been struck. As head of the order, he will have the power to send Princess and Magger to the Tekris, and that is what must happen if we are to find the Codex." "I will dispatch a pyro pigeon," the goblin agreed. Pyro pigeons, like homing pigeons, were trained to deliver messages over long distances. Unlike homing pigeons, pyro pigeons would burst into flames once the message was delivered. "Good. Then I assume our business is concluded," Reservoir said, anxious to get going. "I'm afraid I have other things to attend to." "But of course," the goblin replied, noting the sand in the hourglass and scribbling the time down in a leather-bound notebook. He turned the heavy timepiece over again. "And if I might add, on a personal note, you seem to be doing well for yourself. Continue to honor your agreements with the Male Shadow, and you will be rewarded." "I'm sure," Reservoir said, forcing a smile and rising to his feet. "I don't imagine that he is forgiving of those who fail to satisfy their contracts." The goblin smiled, his rows of sharp teeth looking primitive against his double-breasted suit. "Well, let's just say no one's ever broken a contract with the Lord of Shadows twice." Chapter 8. Under a Cheeseburger Moon. The Tekris Future. When the world came back into focus, Max, Dirk, Sarah, and Dwight were no longer standing around the glass counter at the Dragon's Den. Instead, they found themselves in the middle of a forest lit by moonlight. And then, adding to the strangeness of the situation, the dagger Dwight was holding decided to speak. Remember, the walls you build not only keep others out, but keep you in. I think that's important at a time like this. You shut your trap and stay out of this, Dwight grunted, scowling at the ornate blade in his hand. The dagger's hilt was carved from a solid piece of ivory that took the shape of a man with his hands folded across his stomach. A carved head served as the pommel, and the long body with chest, arms, and belly formed the grip. Farther down, the figure blended into the shape of a horse, as if he were mounted on it, the head and tail forming the dagger's brass guard. The blade itself was heavy and double-sided, but it was the ivory face that was the most curious, a face that was looking around and taking things in. Sarah stared at the dagger. Your knife talked. Dirk, however, was looking up at the night sky. Cool, he announced with his usual enthusiasm. Somebody turned the moon into a cheeseburger. It wasn't that the moon was literally a cheeseburger. It just seemed to have a certain cheeseburgerness about it, as if someone had covered it with a food-themed lampshade. Okay, you guys, I'm a little confused, Sarah managed to say, reaching out to pull on a branch in order to confirm that it was real. The group was in a clearing, surrounded by the ancient remains of broken, vine-covered walls. I think we're in some kind of ruin, Dirk suggested. Oh, been to a lot of ruins, have you? Dwight asked, waving the dagger around as he spoke, causing Max to take several steps back. No, Dirk admitted, but I've played lots of games where you had to explore ruins and stuff. Look, you can see bits and pieces of old walls, and see how the ground is more barren over there? Maybe that was a street or something. I'm sure your game experiences are fascinating and full of important insights, Sarah interjected, her voice sounding a little unhinged. But we were just standing in the middle of a store, right? I mean, that's where we should be right now, not here, in the middle of all this. And yet here is where we are, Dwight said, spitting. You humans think you're so smart with all your fancy doodads, but you don't know nothing, not when magic's involved. Ha! Dirk shouted, pointing at Dwight. You called us humans and said magic. You're totally busted, dwarf. You might want to watch your tone, Dwight threatened. But Dirk had already moved on, having decided to rummage around the clearing a bit. Sarah looked at Max, her face expectant, as if he was about to let her in on some kind of elaborate joke. Max, she finally said, watching him closely. What is this, one of those TV shows where people are pranked or something? How did you get us outside like this? I don't know, Max blurted out. Honest, I have no idea what's going on. Max looked down at the book in his hand. A knot formed in the middle of his stomach. This was his fault. He didn't know how, but it was all the same. The book was the key. Maybe we're still at the Dragon's Den, Dirk said, sounding as if he knew what he was talking about. And how's that supposed to make any sense? Sarah asked. Unless Dwight put something in those incense candles and we're all lying on the floor and hallucinating. You mean like vanilla? Dwight asked, sounding a bit defensive. But Dirk was pulling on something beneath the leaves. Over here, you guys. Give me a hand. Max tucked the codex under his arm, and he and Sarah walked over to where Dirk was trying to free something from the ground. They squatted down and began digging around some kind of object. It seemed to be metallic and maybe glass. Hurry, Dirk exclaimed, growing excited. Dwight ignored him, however. He had sheathed his dagger and was investigating something else that was buried at his feet. After a few moments, Max helped Dirk and Sarah pull a sturdy glass and metal frame from the ground. They leaned it forward as Dirk brushed off years of dirt and grime. It was cracked and damaged, but the faded remains of a black light poster could still be seen in the moonlight. You can still make it out, Dirk said. Max and Sarah leaned in for a closer look. It's like that poster hanging on the wall, Sarah finally said, her face looking pale in a strange orangish light of the cheeseburger moon. Back at the Dragon's Den, The one with the skeleton riding the motorcycle. Not like, Dirk said definitively, taking the frame and laying it carefully against a small chunk of what might have been a wall. It's the same one. That's impossible, Sarah said, but she didn't sound completely convinced. What have you done, Max? Dwight asked, his voice tight. He was looking down at the remains of an old cash register. What do you mean? I didn't do anything. Dirk pulled something else from the dirt and stepped forward. It was a set of game dice covered in grimy plastic. Game dice, he announced. Now we're talking really old school. Dirk, quit messing around, Max shouted. Dirk, however, was unfazed. Don't you get it? Dirk continued, looking around the group. We didn't get teleported someplace else. We've been sent when else. That's not even a word, Sarah exclaimed. Not important right now, Dirk continued. We've been totally transported into the future. The future, Max replied, making sure he'd heard his friend right. Yep. Look, we're standing in the middle of the dragon's den right now. There's the poster, the dice, and that's my cash register, Dwight added, motioning to it at his feet, and not sounding too happy about it. No, it can't. Max managed to get out, but he couldn't finish. He had felt something powerful move in the codex right before everything changed. And why not? Dirk continued, folding his arms. Got a better explanation? Well, because this is real life, Max replied, as much for its own benefit as that of his friends. You can't just jump forward in time. Well, that's not exactly true, Sarah offered, looking up at the night sky. GPS satellites have to have their clocks adjusted back because they tick faster than the clocks on Earth. The closer to the Earth, the higher the gravity, and that changes how fast something moves through time. Einstein had it right, theoretically. Theoretically? Dwight exclaimed, walking over to where the group was standing. You have no idea what you're talking about. You think you're so smart with all your science and learning, but you've got no idea about magic. Magic isn't real, Sarah said defensively. Then how do you explain the talking dagger? Dirk asked. Or did Einstein just make delicious bagels? Huh? Sarah answered, Dirk's logic causing her brain to momentarily malfunction. Dwight, however, was pacing back and forth and mumbling under his breath. Stupid, stupid, stupid. I should have known. Dwight stopped and turned to Max. You know what I'm talking about, don't you? You're the one that read from the book. Max? Sarah asked, looking at him strangely. Max didn't like being the cause of things, the one who was responsible. He grabbed the codex with both hands and looked at his friends. Okay, I felt something happen at the Dragon's Den. The book showed me things. It was like I was a different person in a different world. But it was confusing and everything was spinning around and then it was black and then white and then we were here. But it wasn't what I wanted. The book's never done that before. It was when Dwight pulled the knife. That's what started it all. Oh no, this isn't my fault, Dwight exclaimed, pointing a finger at Max. Read me the cover of your book. Max turned the book around so he could read it. The Codex of Infinite Knowability by Maximilian Sparazzo. Exactly, Dwight exclaimed. Unbelievable. You walk into my store with only the most powerful book in the three realms and then read from it like you're the world's thunderer himself. What do you expect would come from that? Dwight unhooked his scabbard and thrust a dagger toward Max. Here, take it. Magic said nothing but make my life miserable. Dwight pushed the sheathed blade into Max's arms, forcing him to take it. You want to play wizard, boy? Well, here you go. Max fumbled with the book and dagger. He didn't really want the knife, but it was better than having it pointed at him. The moment he grabbed hold of it, however, the little ivory face lit up. Greetings, Max. I'm Glenn, the legendary dagger of motivation, and I think everything's going to work out just great. Wicked cool, Dirk exclaimed. Okay, Max offered. It wasn't my choice to come to your world, Dwight continued, ignoring Glenn. I don't like living around humans. I don't like your small food portions and foul air. I don't care for reality television or microwave popcorn. And I especially hate the way you're so tall and full of yourselves. I lived in the Techros because I had to. I started a business and made a life. Now you've gone and destroyed it. All because you're too arrogant of a race to know when you shouldn't be playing with things you don't understand. Okay, everyone, let's just settle down, Sarah said, doing her best to sound calm. We don't know what's happened. So far, we're just exploring possibilities. What are you talking about? Dirk exclaimed, looking around. It's just like Dwight said. Max's Codex is really a powerful spellbook. That's why it shocks everyone but him. Dwight here is a real dwarf from, I don't know, Dwarfistan or something. And Max is some sort of wizard. Which is awesome, he just needed to panic in order to access his magical mojo. I don't think panic is the right word, Max said, looking at Sarah. Panicked, Dirk continued. So we cast a spell to get away, but instead of transporting us to some place, we jumped into the future, which honestly is understandable. Max is like barely level 1. And I suppose I turned the moon into a cheeseburger too, Max added, doing his best to show just how ridiculous the whole notion of him being a wizard was. Yeah, well, if anywhere is going to have a cheeseburger moon, it's the future, Dirk shot back. Maybe you have to read as much sci-fi as I do, but trust me, that's what happened. I know it's agonizing to have to agree with Dirk, Dwight grumbled, looking at Max, but that book is the real codex of infinite knowability. The dwarfs kept it safe for years. I even grew up hearing the stories myself. I don't know how you ended up with it, or why you can read it. But that doesn't matter. You can, you did, and now you have to do it again. But I didn't do anything, really. It's more like the book did it to me, Max protested. Dwight produced a lighter from his pocket, giving it a shake by his ear to determine how much fluid it had left. Well, it didn't do it by itself, so you'd better get to figuring it all out. Magic is what brought us here, and only magic is going to get us home. Go now, open that book of yours, and start reading. Just because I think it's okay for Max to read his book, it doesn't mean I agree with you about all this, Sarah said defiantly. There has to be other explanations we haven't considered yet. Sure, Missy, you think about those all you want while gathering firewood. The rest of us will build a fire and make camp. It's cold, it's dark, we're someplace out of time, and the moon is a giant cheeseburger. I don't know what it all means, but I got a feeling it ain't good.